You're here and glad to be with you, and we're going to have a different sort of experience today. Note it says dialogue, pastoral dialogue. And we are all going to have a dialogue today, and forgive me for sitting. I had my Achilles tendon rebuilt a few months ago, and the revised model wasn't as good as the original. And standing is not my strength right now. A couple of housekeeping things. Cokesbury is out in the hallway. I will mention some resources and books in the course of our dialogue today. And if you think you might have interest, they will give you a good price and free shipping if you order it. I'm not advocating my own books. 3 of the 4 are out of print. The only one that has copies is my mother, and she has dementia, so you can't get them from her. She doesn't know where they are. Our approach today is to talk about this difficult connection of faith and money, and we're going to do it with cartoons and dialogue. I'm going to show a cartoon to you, and then you'll see my take on that cartoon with a new question. And then we're going to discuss that. And I've collected stewardship cartoons for a long, long time. I've tried to train clergy. How many of you are clergy? Raise your hands. Confess. Okay. Well, I found it easier to teach you folks with cartoons than words and Bible and stuff. And so we're going to do it with pictures today. If you have your Bible, I'd like you to turn to 1 Timothy in the 6th chapter. And I'm going to sort of read over some verses and then focus in on some. Now, some of you will be real familiar with these verses because I've used them a lot. Some of you won't. Starting in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7, we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. Do y'all agree with that? You do? So you all have a will, right? Our theology is that God owns it all and we're the managers, so you've made provisions to leave part of what He's entrusted to you to kingdom purposes. Is that right? All of you have done that. Some of you have made planned gifts, like gift annuities and trusts, because God has richly blessed you. You know, the conversation that I always find funny in a group like this is some of you who say, Michael, you don't understand our situation. I live on a fixed income. Well, yeah, but some of you are really well fixed. And you need to remember who fixed you and what for. I mean, it's for the purposes of the kingdom of God. God still owns it. Let me illustrate this with a thing that I put in one of my books. Years ago, I was working in a large African-American church in Chicago on the south side near Cabrini Green, the largest public housing disaster we have in the country. And it was a historic church, Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church. Interesting civil rights history, interesting spiritual history. So I was working with them over a winter, and I flew in one night. It was snowing. I landed at Midway, and I was going to have a meeting the next morning. And I got to the hotel, and, I flipped on the news, and it was the local news, and they were giving an article about a drug dealer who had been shot down in a drug war, and it was about his wake. And there was a line in the snow that was probably 2 blocks long of people waiting to get in and pay their respects to this man. His name was Darrell Fluke. I mean, this stuck in my mind. It was such an interesting story. And they said he was well known. He was from the South Side, and he used some of his profits from his illicit gain to do things for the community and buy credibility. Well, that's not unusual. And so the next morning I went to this church, and I was meeting with about 25 ladies, and they were writing invitations to an event, and they were talking, and I was answering questions when they had them, and the conversation moved to Daryl Fluke in the wake. Did you make it to Daryl's wake? No, I didn't. It was too nasty out last night. I just didn't want to be there. Well, that was something, wasn't it? Yeah, it was. And there was a guy out there selling T-shirts that said I was at Fluke's wake, and they commented on that, and he was buried in a coffin shaped like a Cadillac, with him sort of sitting up with and appreciate this was like 86, 7. He had one of those big modular phones in his hand and a briefcase in the other hand. And culturally, in the inner city in Chicago, that was indicative of his life. Well, I know he did bad things, but he tried to remember his community and atone for it. I mean, he sponsored Little League, and he sponsored Pee Wee football, and he made contributions to things. And one lady was listening to it all and hadn't said much, and the lady next to her said, well, I know he made a lot of money. I wonder how much he left. And the lady who hadn't said much said, well, I imagine he left it all. And sometimes you need those lucid moments to remember that our stuff is transient and it's all going to be left. So why wouldn't you have a will? You're never going to die? Is that your thought? Well, you know how silly that is. We're all destined for mortality here, not immortality, except in a heavenly term. So here we have this verse. We brought nothing into the world, so we can't take anything out of it. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. And I have found that to not be true. In my experience, food and covering isn't enough. I need some stuff. And apparently my wife and I have done a bang-up job. I retired from local church last year to just focus on teaching, and and my wife and I have been downsizing for years. I don't know how you can do that without finally getting downsized. We live in a house half the size we lived in 10 years ago. But if you were to go into my garage, you would find mystery boxes. They are boxes that have labels from 3 or 4 different moves that haven't been opened, apparently, in the last couple. And we don't obviously need this stuff. Have y'all had these conversations with your spouse about where did we get all of that? A friend of mine was Jim Tarr. He was CEO of Boy Scouts back in the 70s and 80s. Lived in the same house for almost 40 years, and he and his wife had retired. He was in his early 80s. They were moving to a retirement center, and he said, we're spending the summer moving. And I said, well, what does that involve? And he said, well, I get my son to go up in the attic and bring down a box. And we spend a week or so with that box, and then we give it away. And then my son will get another box down. We'll spend a week going through that. He said, I'm going to be 100 years old before we can move out of this house, but all the crap that I have up in my attic. My wife and I actually had a conversation about why it was necessary to have 7 sets of dishes. That was a rational thought. Well, we've got our china, but we haven't used it twice a year since we got it. We've been married 44 years. And she's got her mamas. I've got my grandmother's. Well, you can't get rid of those. Those are lineage, heritage stuff. Oh, my goodness. And we fear getting rid of our stuff. It brings us some kind of security, doesn't it? Our stuff. Gentlemen, some of you have tools that you don't know what to do with, and when you die, probably before your wife, because you're worried about her dishes, she isn't going to know what to do with those tools, and no one's going to want them. Your kids aren't going to want them. I'll tell you one that was astonishing to me. My grown sons have no interest in my doctoral papers. I wrote a perfectly good paper in educational psychology, and the title was B.F. Skinner, Freedom and Ecclesiology, and those boys don't value that document. I don't understand that. And the sermons I've stolen and preached, and the Bible notes and that aren't organized, and my 400 stewardship cartoons, and I just have this frightening nightmare of a vision of a big dumpster after I die. Maybe that would be good for us. So it goes on in Scripture. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. Not me. And but those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money, not money, but the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many a pang. But flee from these things, you man and woman of God. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. And part of that fight is in this area of connecting our faith and our money. That's what stewardship is about. It's not about raising the money for the budget. The mission of the church is not to have a balanced budget. How many of you are bankers and just grabbed your chest? But that's what the finance committee acts like. How many of you serve on finance committee? Raise your hand. Okay, I've got a verse for you. Before you have your next finance committee meeting, I don't know what they are in your church. It's not generally a time of revival when we have that meeting. And read Philippians 4:8. I'm not going to read it to you, but I want you to read it before your next finance committee. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. You can look it up at your leisure. See, there's value to bringing a Bible to church, isn't there? Yeah, I don't know why we don't do that either. And then he says, when he says fight the good faith and fight of faith and take hold of the eternal life to which you were called, then look at verse 17. Here's what we're to do. You as leaders, you as clergy, we are to instruct those who are rich in this present world. That's us. You want to see poverty? You know, I'm a lot more likely to believe somebody in the church in the Boca section of Buenos Aires, Argentina, when they say we are poor, than I am when I hear the same words in a church in Knoxville. I'm sorry. Compared to the world's population, we are extraordinarily affluent. And it says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited about their wealth or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of that wealth. You want to talk about uncertainty? Let's go back to 2008. Let's go back to any number of events in the Great Recession. Uncertainty of wealth. I have a friend who's a retired major general, and he was saying, you know, this retirement thing's getting more difficult every day. And he said, I was taught to, you know, a safe bet was to ladder some CDs, but it doesn't matter how high the ladder is. If it's at less than 1%, it's not much of a ladder. Well, isn't that true? And your church does the same thing. You put money and you're getting half a point or 3/4 of a point interest at the local bank, and the local banker on the finance committee, I'm not going to ask you to confess if you're a banker. It's just too much and too public here. But here's the deal. You could put money in the fixed fund at the foundation and earn more. Now, what's better stewardship? Buying the loyalty of the banker? Well, certainly that banker tithes and doesn't drive a Hummer. And then he says, instruct those in this present world not to be conceited or fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works. In the Message, it says to be extravagantly generous and ready to share. Where does it say in there? Instruct them to withhold spending on ministry if you're low at the end of summer. Where does that come from? You know, we look at it and we take our money, our budget, and we say we need this much every month. No, you don't. It's not how it comes in, never has been. That's not how it goes out. You're supposed to be low at the end of summer. And you make up for it in the fourth quarter. Think retail, okay? Post-Thanksgiving, you're going to get a disproportionate amount of income. But that can't let you look at the low ebb of your cash flow in the year and curtail ministries. You've got to plan better. Then he says, the reason that we instruct them to do this is so that they'll store up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. There is a life in our culture of accumulation, acquisition, consumption, and then there's one that's spiritual. And the spiritual life is one of generosity, doing good works, upholding the faith. Wesley put it this way: gain all you can. It's okay to make a lot of money, just don't abuse others or yourself in the process. Save all you can. He wasn't talking about wise mutual fund selection, if there is such a thing. He was talking about living prudently, not having to have every new item that came out. You know, I don't know about you, but I have a smartphone. Now, I was bewildered in my last church when they told me that I had to have one, and because I didn't feel like I was all that smart, and I'm not good with technology. This last Christmas, my 8-year-old grandson gave me an hour tutorial on my iPhone. When we were through, his little brother said, "Don't I get any iPhone time?" I mean, complete humiliation. My 7th grade granddaughter, Avery, in Austin, Texas, goes to a science and math academy for girls. And I asked her last week, she was with us for the weekend, and I said, "What are you taking this year?" She's in 7th grade, and she said, "Well, I'm particularly excited about 3 engineering courses I'm taking." What? I was looking for spelling, coloring, you know, crafts, homemaking, that sort of thing. This life that we're to live should be so distinctive, and money is where it shows up. But why is it that is so hard for us to do in church? See, it's a spiritual issue. It is an issue about our faith and the expression of our faith and the expression of love for our God. Now, some of you have heard this story, and forgive me for retelling it, but it's a good story. I told it last night to some of you in the leadership group, and some of you have been in a seminar, have heard it before, but I tell it every time I get to speak. When my eldest granddaughter was about 22 months, she finally call me by the right name. You know, she started really getting verbal about 14 months. But she was sort of standoffish with her daddy and with me. And she wouldn't look me in the eye very often. But she would try names on me. You know, Paw Paw and Paco and Popeye and stuff. And I just wouldn't react like I'd hurt her, because I wanted to be Grandpa. That's what I wanted. You don't always get what you want, but I was pretty determined. So after a few minutes, I'd say, Avery, Grandpa. Avery, Grandma. She knew what to say. She got Grandma real quick. So 22 months old, we're at a preschool playground in a mall, and she's showing me stuff, and she performs this little crawl through a tunnel and come out, and you know, and I didn't do anything. And she frowned at me. Have you ever had a 22-month-old frown at you? And she did it again. I was supposed to clap or hoot or something. And she yelled at me, Grandpa. It's the first time she said it. And I just lost it. I ran over and picked her up and I said, you want Grandpa to buy you a car? And I wanted to express my love to her by giving. God so loved the world, it's part and parcel of our faith. What do we fear in this area? Let's put up the first slide. And let's have a conversation about that. What do we fear? Now, I would say those children had some fear. Looks like an ogre at the front door. The mom doesn't look too pleasant. What's the question that we ought to ask about this? What is the greatest fear you have about financial stewardship in your church? In this section, somebody share. What's your greatest fear? Being told no. Fear of rejection. What else?
Satisfaction with the status quo.
Your fear is that people are satisfied with things as they are, don't want to give any more. But you know, it says in 2 Corinthians 8:7, Paul says to the leaders in Corinth, y'all do so many things well, but you need to grow in this grace of giving. It says that in the book. It's actually there. You can read it. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 7. What's the greatest fear that you have?
The thing all we preachers want to talk about is money. We don't want the money.
Or they're going to say that if you do it or not. How often do you think Jesus spoke about money in his recorded ministry? What?
Like 3/4 of the time.
A lot. Jesus spoke first about the kingdom of God, and the second most discussed subject in his ministry was the connection of faith and money. Whether he was talking about the poor or giving or charity or generosity. So if pastors preached as often about the connection of faith and money as Jesus did, would that be a good model? A third of the time, 17 Sundays out of 52? Well, if you've been at your church more than a year, you haven't done that because they wouldn't have you stay. There is some fear of rejection at that point. What other fears do you have? Think about it. That people will leave. Who will leave? People that don't want to give will leave. People who joined your church, who said, yes, I will support this local church with my prayers, presence, service, gifts, and witness. They said that they would give, but if you talk about those membership vows, they'll leave. Okay. And why is that bad? Help me here. You have a non-giver that gets mad when you talk about giving, and they leave. Okay, what's the downside of their leaving? Numbers.
People feel you ran them off.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they're sometimes your best leaders, and they've sort of been hiding behind the fact that they're not giving. So you may lose.
You have some best leaders who are not giving. How do you vet leaders on your nominating group? You need to vet whether they're giving or not.
But I'm only the chairperson of the nominations committee. Everyone shouldn't know the pattern of giving of others in the congregation.
You're the pastor?
I'm the pastor.
You should know.
I do know, but ensuring that I can lead people, but I can't be totally open with them about my preferences for positions solely because.
Oh, I would challenge that. I would say that you could, in a nominating committee, say, I am privileged to have some information that is not publicly available, and I think there might be another venue of service for these folks, but not this one. Lest you get people in leadership of finances who don't give. Do you really want people that don't have the gift of giving to be on finance, stewardship, trustees, PPR? What you really need is a retiree who doesn't give and doesn't like the preacher, and put them on PPR. That makes for a harmonious relationship, doesn't it? I think that one of the roles and one of the purposes in the book of discipline of you being chair of nominating is that you bring privileged information. It might be that they're having some problem that folks aren't aware of. The idea that we're not to talk about this, that's strange to me. If you're not supposed to talk about money, how do you deal with sin? Do you talk about that at all? Well, in a lot of Methodist churches, we don't. But afraid of offending somebody who's sinning, and they're going to leave and go somewhere else? Are you following the illogic of that? Giving, our connection of our faith in money, is a spiritual issue. What other fears do you have? And pastors, you particularly, what fears do you? Yes, ma'am. Not stepping out in faith because you're afraid they won't give. Well, how do you win people to Christ? Isn't that that's the first tenet of the quadrilateral purpose? Save souls, make disciples, spread scriptural holiness, reform the nation. That's why we exist as Methodists. Most of your churches would ascribe to some dimension of making disciples for Christ. Everybody you try to tell about Jesus accept Jesus? Well, the same thing in giving. In giving, there's a lot of recidivism. People start giving and then they'll stop. One author, Arthur Simon, in the book How Much Is Enough, said, it's not that we've tried the gospel and found it not satisfying. It's that we have tried mammon and found it intoxicating. And it's made following Christ inconvenient because there's this stuff. Some of you have seen the series by Adam Hamilton called Enough, and he demonstrates giving with apples. And he has a basket of apples, and he says, you know, I've got an apple and it's for my mortgage, and I have an apple and it's for my car, and I have an apple and it's for food, and I have an apple for utilities, and here's this apple and it's God's apple. But the big ball game is coming up and they have a sale on flat screens, and I really want a big screen flat screen TV. And so he carves out part of that apple and eats it. And it's good. And then there's something else. There's this trip that he's been promising his spouse, and he takes that out of that apple. And before long, you've just got a core that you're giving to God or leaving for God. And good illustration of the priorities of stuff in our life. What other kind of fear do you have? Yes?
You mentioned vetting.
Yes.
The giving.
Yes.
Okay, what is the yardstick that you should use when you're vetting these people? If it's a very wealthy person and they're only giving 2% or something, that might be 50% of the church's income.
It's true.
Now, why or how do you go over that hurdle and allow this person who is not doing the job that God is expecting and that you are expecting, not you personally, but that you are expecting as a finance officer or a pastor of that church? How do you approach that person, vet them out of their office?
Okay. Excellent question. Let me repeat the question. The question is, how do you vet in nominating? How do you assess if what they're giving is appropriate? And I'll just tell you what I've done in that setting, because you're right. There are people who could probably, according to the economics of the situation, they could probably give the whole church budget and not miss it, because God has richly blessed them. I don't know what they're giving to other things. I'm not going to fight the fight of all of the first 10% has to go to the church or the temple. I'm not going to get into that conversation. You might, but I'm not. And the thing that we have done in some of the churches that I've served in counsel with is the pastor has that knowledge or access to that information. Or even if the pastor doesn't, the pastor establishes some sense of expectation. Here's what I've done. I have said that if a person is not giving $100 a month or more, they should not be considered for a position of leadership on the financial committees. If they've given nothing under $100 in the year, they're not considered for any leadership. On some of the key committees, like a capital campaign study committee or the finance committee, you might actually want to have a conversation with them. And the conversation goes like this: Roger, I want you to know that the nominating committee has interest in your serving in this capacity. But I wanted to talk to you about the expectation of giving we have. Because I think one of the expectations is that you are either tithing or growing toward the tithe and have a plan to get there. I don't know what you make, but I'm pretty sure that it's not $12,000 a year and you gave $1,200 last year. So, what is your plan for growing in the grace of giving? Because that's a prerequisite. And I've had that conversation. And people generally aren't offended. Sometimes they break out in a sweat, but, as a theologian, I would say they're under conviction. But I think somebody has to have that conversation. We'll come back to that in another one of the questions in a minute. Yes, ma'am. Her comment is, that's just good common sense. Well, there's just not a lot of that going on in churches. I'm sorry. That is not one of the overt gifts that I'm aware of being demonstrated out there. let me put it this way. I've had pastors in some really large churches, and I have said, I would like and they don't know what people give. It's all secret. And I've gone to the financial secretary and said, write out in order of giving, not the amounts, just the names of the top 10 or top 20 donor families in the order of giving. Who's number 1 donor, 2, 3, 4. And I've had pastors in large churches say that they didn't know 4 or 5 of those families, didn't know who they were. That's a shock to me. You have people with the gift of giving and you don't even know who they are, and they're the ones most ardently financially supporting what you're doing. Now, I know some of y'all are sitting here saying, Pastor, having that kind of knowledge, well, they would treat them different. Well, then you don't want anybody going to your pastor and confessing a moral failure, do you? Because if you can't be trusted with what you give, they certainly can't be trusted with sins that you've committed. You don't want them doing marriage counseling. You don't want them talking about sin. See how inconsistent that is? And where do you find that in the book that the pastor's not supposed to know? I'm not talking about looking over and evaluating everybody every week. I'm talking about having access because they're chair of nominating, and that we have to trust the spiritual leadership that God has put in place so that the church can function. I'm sort of amazed at that. I have an accountability session every year with my pastor. Now, I've had pastors reluctant to have that. I'll sit down, and it's no easier for me to give than it is for you. I've gone through all the things you have. I'm dealing with aging parents now. It's a very difficult experience financially. I've put 2 kids through college. I always say, one graduated in 3.5 years, summa cum laude, and the other crammed college into 6 years and graduated, thank the Lottie. It's a true statement. I went through 10 years of college tuition. I went through 10 years of 2 teenage boys driving cars, one of them being a good driver, and one of them being artistic. I understand the demands of money. It's no easier for me, but accountability, we'll get into accountability in a minute. Any other comments on fears that we have? Yes, sir. Fear about the largest donor in the church passing away. Okay, that's an excellent one, because some of you have that situation, and that's why God made a foundation in your conference, so that that person can talk to them and put in place an endowment upon their death, a bequest into a trust that would continue to benefit the kingdom of God. And it will benefit your church, but probably some other concerns of their heart as well. And they can have that conversation with your people easier than you can as pastors. It's not an easy conversation for us sometimes to sit down and say, I got news for you, you're going to die, and I want you to leave part of it to the church. And that's not an easy conversation. That's probably not the best approach. Y'all don't use that approach, do you? All the time. Golly. Well, trust them. At least you won't be blamed for the bad conversation. They will. But that's what they do. They do that all the time. They can sit down and look at options. They have software to project things. Listen, we dealt in Louisiana when I was president of the Methodist Foundation. We dealt with a lady, she was 90 years old, the widow of a banker. He had taught her how to ladder CDs and how to preserve their nest egg in her later years. She was in assisted living, and she had shared with her pastor that she wanted him to come to a meeting with her daughter and her accountant. She's getting up in years. Her health was getting a little sketchy. And she said, we have a CD, it's $100,000, and we're going to leave it to the church. He had been to one of the clergy training things. He didn't remember very much, like most clergy, but he remembered that there might be a better way than that bequest. And at her age, that's the top of the scale for returns on gift annuities. And we sat down with her, and she made it very clear, I need the income from that $100,000. It's just my reserve in case something happens. Well, she was 90. She was in poor health. There wasn't much else that could happen. And they asked,
Current rate's 9%.
9. And back when we were doing this, it was 12. And so she was getting,
And 86% is tax-free.
and she was getting, see, he's got all that information right there in print. If I'm 90 and I'm getting, 0.75% on a one-year CD, and I'm told if I go ahead and give the $100,000 and buy a gift annuity that will go to my church when I die, and they're going to pay me 9%, well, we told this lady because of her age she was going to get 12%. And those rates are nationally determined. And she said, you mean I don't have to shop CDs anymore? No, ma'am. Well, is this something that we can do pretty soon? Yes. My CD matures in 2 weeks. Can you get the paperwork ready in time? Yes. Am I limited to the one CD? We have another one we want to give to the Ruston Children's Home. No, ma'am, we can handle that one too. And then when we delivered the document, she was in tears. She said, you don't know what this means. I can now give more to my church. And we said, what do you mean you can give more? She said, I've just increased my income and I'm a tither. It was a win, win, win. Of course, the first time I explained a charitable remainder trust, it was at a wedding reception. And it was to a physician in Margate, New Jersey. He was 71, and my friend, the groom, said, you've got to talk to Dr. Phil. It really was his name. And I sat down with him, and on a cocktail napkin, he was taking notes. And I explained, well, you've got this land, and what you do is you deed the land to a charitable remainder trust, and the trust sells it, and you bypass capital gains. And he said, that sounds good. And I said, then you have distribution of whatever charities. And he said, that sounds good. And I said, you get this kind of tax credit for it. And he said, that sounds wonderful. And he said, now, is this something we have to do offshore? Well, they're your offshore agents. And they go to the Cayman Islands and invest this stuff.
Can you turn the mic off?
Yeah.
No recording.
So the fear of those donors, I'm dealing right now with First Methodist Church in Houston, Texas, great patriarchal church of our faith. 47% of their operational income comes from people over 75 years of age. Their future is interesting, isn't it? And we have told them that more important than their annual campaign is their planned giving campaign. And we're starting that with their conference foundation. And they thought that was the wisest counsel ever. Some of y'all been fearful the foundation's wanting to come get your money. That's just nonsense. They don't want it. They want to help you do right by it and right by the kingdom of God. Let's go to the next slide. Well, that settles it. Our new vision statement will be misery loves company. That's your church. What's your vision or mission statement? Well, let's see what the real question is here. Does your church's mission vision statement drive your budget? Now, how do you create or revise your mission vision statement? Here's what I've observed a lot in Methodist life. We have a retreat, church council or whatever, and they go away and they deliberate and people bring reports and they assess the community and they come back with a page or several paragraphs. That is the mission statement. It's too long for everybody to remember. It goes in a notebook and goes on the shelf and never impacts your budget. It doesn't impact your budget if in August your finance committee says you can't spend any more discretionary money on ministry. It's not affecting your budget at that point, okay? So, how does your vision mission statement drive your budget, or does it? Bill, if you could find out when lunch is, it's not that I'm hungry, but... Okay. So, does it drive your budget? If so, how? Anybody? How many of you have a mission statement, vision statement in your church? Okay. Those of you that have one, is it a consideration in the development of your budget or the management of your finances? Yes, sir.
Our budget, or our finance committee and the budget uses the enabling attitude as disciple. We want to enable the ministries of our vision.
Say that again. I forgot that we had that.
The budget of our church, the finance committee of our church uses the attitude of enabling the vision statement of our church, which is changing lives. We try not to disable, we try to enable, and so we look towards what financing do we need for the ministries of the church.
The issue over here, his comment was, well, no, in a practical sense, functional sense, it doesn't impact because we're more in a survival mode to get enough money to cover the basics. You know, an interesting exercise in that, and that's not unusual. An interesting exercise is to put your budget into two categories. One is your fixed expenses, things that you're rather obligated to, like your utilities, your insurance, your staff costs. You would put apportionments into that as an expectation. And then everything else is discretionary. Most churches, more than 80% is fixed. To open the doors and be a Methodist church, this is what's required. And we struggle to get that part. So the question, and this has been discussed at pretty high levels in our church, I love that Weems said the question in this Great Recession is to reset your financial baseline. What is there in that basic required amount that we can change? Is it staffing? Can we replace a staff member with a volunteer in some setting? Is there a way to save on insurance, save on utilities? We've had churches closing a day of the week, having longer hours during the week, and it's usually on a Friday or a Monday. Some think they save money that way and some don't. But trying to make some of those hard decisions before you look at discretionary. And how would you know if you have enough money this year to do something? Well, you do quarterly comparisons. Let's say you're in a small church and your budget is $80,000. That's $20,000 a quarter, supposedly, but it doesn't come in like that, does it? And so here's what you do. You don't compare week to week and how much is in, what the weekly need is, and you don't compare month to month. You compare quarter to quarter. How much did we get the first 3 months of this year? It's 13 weeks, January, February, March. And how much did we have come in last year? Is it more or less? If it's more, we can do more of those discretionary spending. If it's less, we have to do less of that discretionary spending. Are you following the math here? And you do that quarter by quarter. By the end of the second quarter, you can start projecting where you're going to be at the end of the year. And I'm going to share some ideas at the end this afternoon. And oh, by the way, we will end in time for you to get at least close to home by kickoff. Whether it's the 3 o'clock or 3:30 kickoff that you're interested in, okay? I'm going to watch the first half of one of the games at the airport myself. Back to the point at hand. I think it's important for us to understand that that budget has to be flexible. Stop reporting weekly need and monthly need. It's irrelevant information. Because here's what happens. You will not get 1/12 of your money through the first 9 months of the year. That's just a fact. Go back 5 years and look and see if you did. By the end of September, you will not have 75% of the income to your church. So if you report monthly need and received and show a deficit, that does not elicit positive response. And that's why the Finance Committee is a bad meeting to go to in August. You don't want to do that. Skip that meeting. You don't need it. It's all depressing in August. There are some things you can do for that summer slump, and I'll suggest some of those this afternoon as well. All right. Yes, sir. Oh, there you are.
Mine is not a question exactly. I've been in church administration for many years and worked with different churches, and what I see happening is more and more pledging is going into the general budget to do the operational things, and then people are giving to designateds that in turn enable missions and the special things to do in a church. And then what happens is somebody gets angry about something. They want to withhold their money from the general budget
I've
and give
never
it to
heard
the
of that.
designated. Really? What do you do?
I guess it'd be too easy just to say grow up, but not. And you know who's really bad about that? Senior adults. You know, unfortunately, and since I are one, I can say that. The question is about designated. We had a long discussion in the reunion group yesterday about that very subject. And let me tell you what the future holds. There are going to be more designating giving in the future because the younger generation, being under 50, the younger generation tend to not pledge, tend to want their money to go to something they understand and value, and that's not the black hole of the budget. And I share this story too often. I preached in a contemporary service in our church, and it's under 45 years of age, folks that have no cash and no checkbooks. And they still pass a plate. How dumb is that? And you need a QR code. You need some capacity for them to give off their iPhone. You need a giving kiosk. You need to emphasize electronic giving because that's how they do their money. But we still pass the plate. It's a part of worship. No, it's not. It's a time for performance art. That's when somebody piddles on the organ, or the drum set in the contemporary service. So here's the issue. We need to enable giving in ways that are relevant to those giving, but younger people don't do pledges very much, and they're going to designate more. God isn't making any more pledgers. Our pledge generation is dying off, and I don't know a church that's having an increased pledging experience unless they're also growing and really hammering that. I'd rather put the energy into just giving. Well, how in the world do you plan a budget? Well, like every other company in the world, and the 80% of churches who don't pledge. You do historic norms and projections. That's how you do it. You've got to make it a little less structured at that point. I know accountants are saying, less structure, oh. But yes, ma'am. Say it into this megaphone.
You have to teach people that part of the reason that you give is so that you can have lights. And so that you can have insurance, so that the church van can take the young people to a Braves game or to wherever the mission thing is. You have to teach them.
But that's very difficult.
The idiosyncrasies of why. I mean, I have money, I pay for my mortgage so that the mortgage people allow me to live there.
Okay, but listen to what she's saying, because it's right. But since we don't want to talk about money at all, it's really hard for a nuanced conversation.
I teach my daughter to turn out a light at church because we're paying for the electricity of that light.
I, in a contemporary service, said, folks, if you want to designate, make sure it's born in prayer and not in anger. Okay, that's a good statement. That's true. It's spiritually stout. And here's why. I've been in ministry a long time, and I have gotten many wonderful, generous gifts designated for youth and children and music and missions. But I have never received a generous gift designated for utilities. And that week, I received a $22,000 stock gift designated for utilities with a note that said, this is so Brother Michael can never use that illustration again. Which provoked me to develop a list of things that I need to say going forward. Go ahead.
We all need to understand that our askings are not, our askings and our, those keywords that we use that those of us who aren't in ministry don't always know what they are. They go to Redbird Mission, they go to these things, they go to United Way organizations. Our employers are beating up myself, church members, wanting United Way contributions. We have to educate our Methodist friends that we're giving to those United Way organizations, the ones that the United Methodist Church condones, appreciates, the ones that probably do things that we like, so that we can give towards the askings or towards the things, and it can be taken care of.
Okay.
I'd like to make
Yeah.
one comment.
Okay.
I think also that we need to have faith in our congregations. You know, that if we get in trouble and we go to them and we tell them we're in trouble, that they're going to come through for us.
Now, she brings up, I mean, these comments are good. I would suggest that this is one of the best ways to overcome the, how do I say this? The pain in the Askins campaign. You know, it'll catch up to you in a minute. If you're talking about what your vision is and return on investment stories and how your investment resulted in a transformed life, that'll help you get past some of that discomfort. Now, let's show the next slide, please. Now, I love this one. Here's a plane. I fly some. The fuel light's on, Frank. We're all going to die. Wait. Oh, my mistake. That's the intercom light. And you see the look of the passengers in the windows. Now, here's what I made out of that cartoon. Does your finance committee or other leaders jump to conclusions financially? I've seen that a lot. Has that ever happened in your church? August. Well, my God, we're not even going to be able to stay open until the rest of the year. We missed our August income. Where'd it go? You ever have that kind of experience? You go there, boy, I tell you, and then when do you start putting together a budget for the new year? September, right after the lowest cash flow in the entire year. So all these people, these bankers, stockbrokers, business owners, they're eager to increase that budget for new ministries and give raises and do more missions. Oh, we're not making our budget now. because you're evaluating it wrong. If you do quarterly comparisons, you'll know if you're ahead or the same. And your vision ought to have an impact. And I don't think that's really good leadership. The story that I've shared in this room before is the church that the finance committee did a number of strange things to save money. They stopped the newsletter, so there wasn't any communication going on. They lowered the wattage of the bulbs in the foyer of the sanctuary. That had to save them 12 cents right there. And after the purchase of the lower wattage. And then they put up a poster for every month in that foyer that had a little spotlight on it. January, needed, received, 6-inch high, hand-done letters, minus, and there was a negative number. I was there in September, and there were 8 posters, and they were all negative. Now, if I'm a member of the church, frankly, I'm going to find a different way to go into the sanctuary. I don't want to see that. It doesn't motivate to reach in my pocket and give more. You know, there is a point that it's true if we have an immediate need that we can communicate that, but you can't do that too much because there's a weariness. It's the, kid that cried wolf too much. Then, if I'm a visitor, new revenue. That's strange. And I come to the church, my logical understanding of seeing that in the foyer welcoming me is, this sucker's about to sink. I want to plot my trough here. I want to go down with it when it goes. Yeah, I want to invest my life and money here. Well, no, it's, my God, I don't even want to stay for worship now. I want to leave. The Titanic UMC. I mean, I want to go down in that last flush. I just think that it's why do we communicate negatively and expect positive response? This ought to be a time of great celebration. You want to see a revival in the Methodist Church? Have a surplus in the operational budget. That's the closest thing to revival some of us will ever have. Honestly, it's a feeling of, oh my gosh, we ended positive. It's a conference that says we're going to try to raise $1 million to fight malaria. Well, we can't do that. We've never done anything like that in our life. And you're almost at $1 million too. My God, yeah, that is clap worthy. Not everybody shared in that celebration. Some were so upset, probably. I don't know. But usually you have some so upset they don't actively take part or support. Well, I don't know what they're trying to do. I mean, if you have that attitude, you can't share in the victory. Oh, but you are. Let's go to the next cartoon. And Roger, get ready. And now at this point in the meeting, I'd like to shift the blame away from me and on to someone else. I told you, get ready. Let's see what I made out of that. Do you have a stewardship leader group? Okay, I want to say this as clearly as I know how. The people that you have on finance are people who have gifts of management and conservation and oversight. And that's what their function is. You want bankers, accountants, business people, okay, that understand business. You want that responsibility. But they are not the characteristics you want for stewardship, being education, sales, promotion, teaching. Okay? And so I advocate that you split those, which is authorized in paragraph 260, point C, in the Book of Discipline. It says the Finance Committee has the responsibility of raising funds to underwrite the budget unless another group is appointed. For God's sake, appoint a group that has the right gifts to do it. Visionary banker. That's an oxymoron. I don't want my banker to be visionary. I don't want my CPA to be visionary. That's why the Arthur Andersen is no longer. I want my banker and CPA to conserve, and I want them to be persnickety about expenditures and check receipts and against reports. That's what I want them to do. But that's not the same people I want to do stewardship, which is a teaching, motivation function. So who do you want on a stewardship group? Well, you could have a whole separate stewardship team, and it would be people that knew how to do graphic layout and communication. It could be somebody in printing and publishing or public relations. It could be a teacher, especially a teacher who gives. I tell you what, it's inevitable that I see churches, major churches, where a teaching family, a husband and wife who teach, are in the top 10 donors, and not because of affluence, but because of faithfulness. That's who I want on stewardship. In San Antonio, we had a church of 3,000 families, 6,000 members. On my stewardship team was a single mom with an 11-year-old daughter, school teacher, who tithed. On my stewardship team was a widow, mother of a developmentally challenged 30-year-old Down syndrome daughter, who worked at our church, who tithed. She tithed when her husband passed from the insurance settlement. That's who I want on stewardship. They've learned something. I've got a chiropractor who does well in his practice, who more than tithes. That's who I want. So in a smaller church, you don't have a separate group. I understand there's a limitation of members. Have one or two designated to be on finance who have those gifts, and have them do a subcommittee of finance that does whatever kind of education. And let me tell you, it's not just doing a campaign. It is doing reports that have meaning, lining up ministry stories and testimonies, providing stewardship education, coordinating Financial Peace or Crown Ministries are one of the excellent financial education programs for all different ages. There's a lot that a stewardship focus can do. So I encourage you to do that. Any questions, testimonies at that point? Okay. Let's do one more cartoon, and then we're going to have a shift of gears. Our giving is on budget for March. Unfortunately, it's now September. I have been in that meeting. And that's a difficult meeting. Do you do an adjustment? Do you do an extra thing? Some of the ideas I'm going to have this afternoon will address some of these, but let's see what I made out of this one. How do you report finances in your church? If you're, you know what the dominant response to this is in Methodism? Whining. Whining. At various points in the year, whining. We're behind. We're not going to pay our apportionments. And if we don't pay our apportionments, I could get reappointed. And then nobody's going to give the apportionments. I mean, yeah, and you know, that's a really dicey thing for a pastor to say. How do you report finances? I would suggest to you the old method of doing that with this line item budget and all of that. The report that comes out from the computer is not the method of communicating. It's the method of managing. Very few people understand that or care about that. Here's what they want to know. They want to know how their investment is making a difference. Am I just putting money in there so we meet payroll? Well, I like the pastor and all, but you know, return on investment stories are the best way to report the finances. Now, you can say, if you would like a detailed financial report, it's available from the financial secretary. You're not trying to keep information from people, but you're trying to give information to the most people that is most helpful, most encouraging, most clarifying about how the money's being spent. We spent $117 in youth ministry, and here's what we did. And you talk about ministry and how lives were touched. And I would say that you do that on a quarterly basis. There's a couple of other more grand ways to do that that we'll present this afternoon. And you're going to have several takeaways of some ideas that you can maybe find one or two that you want to try, okay? I'm trying to keep you until just before kickoff. But, and let's do one more, and then I'm going to turn it over to Roger. Let's go to the next cartoon. There we go. That's one that fits this room particularly. There, but by the grace of God, go I. How many of you have a contemporary service? Raise your hands. Is that thing just a hallelujah runaway for y'all? Well, in some churches it is. I mean, it is here. It's working. I want to be sensitive to this. The pastor of the contemporary service in my last church, when I joined the staff, said, "What service will you be doing?" And I said, "Well, what service choices do I have?" And there were several, and some of them are at the same time. And I said, "Well, I will be going to the 11 o'clock traditional like God intended." And I don't want to be set in my ways, but that's who I am. Well, let me tell you something. At our church, at university, that service, that contemporary service, is the one that's growing because there are a lot of young people there. And they have a form of worship that I don't get into. For one thing, I can't stand up that long. I don't like singing songs over and over and over and over, you know, the same words. Those are things, I'm 65, I'm sorry, I just don't, unless it's in a Beatles tune, I don't like repetitious. And, you know, or Hank Williams. Either one of those is okay for me. But they want to do things in that service that just make me a little uncomfortable. But thank God they're doing it because they're reaching more people for Christ in our culture. You know what spawned out of our contemporary? Spawn sort of sounds negative, doesn't it? But what came out of that was skateboard church. A whole segment of our population is unrelated and alienated, and usually single parents. And we have a full-time guy on the staff that just does skateboard church, has 60 coming. Last year had 15 professions of faith of these skateboard kids and their parents, usually moms. It got us in the reform school for ministry. That's creative ministry. I'm not all that creative, but thank God we have diversity. How did I take this one? What is unique about stewardship at your church? Now, whining is not unique. That's normative. So what besides whining do you do that's really unique about stewardship in your church? Anybody? Sort of wish. Okay.
In the last 3 years or so, we changed the focus on the stewardship, if you want to call it campaign, from the budget to what does God want me to do. And so our stewardship focus for about the last 3 years has been on what does God want me to do? What's He been asking me to do? What's my share? And we don't really talk about the budget that much. There's information, but not that much.
That puts it in a mode of a spiritual consideration rather than fundraiser. It's an excellent approach. Anybody else want to share over there? Down the aisle?
I probably don't need the mic.
we are non-traditional in collection, in that there is a time in the service where the baskets are brought forth by the acolytes, and I would do an appeal, sometimes something that might have come from the Holston Foundation, yes, when you used to send those out. But it would be a celebration of things that we're doing, and then do scriptural passages like a cheerful giver, things of that nature, and that is, then they take the baskets back, and the collection is actually taken in the baskets as people leave church, so that part of response to the word is that has been placed in their hearts to give, to support ministry, and it is reiterated through the sermon and through the invitation that as they leave, there's been a total spiritual experience that they're responding to, and that has allowed a church with about 25 significant giver units to satisfy a $120,000 a year budget with no suppers and fundraisers like fish fries, just 2 campaigns a year. And we've been able to continue to do ministry in our community with a full-time pastor paying pastoral support.
2 points that he makes. One is the use and effective use and positioning of offertory. And I know some of you think, well, we know where that goes. It goes where it always has gone. And that's when the organ plays, or the drums are. And that's not true. That can be rethought. And you need to be creative in offering. And also that it's a part of the overall worship experience. The processional, the recessional are all valuable. The other thing that he brought up that we can get into this afternoon is the whole issue of fundraiser events. Some of y'all do that to your detriment. And I just want to encourage you to pray about it. I don't think God is honored when we have a fall harvest, as my church described it, where we bring our junk and other church members buy it and we buy their junk, and then 2 years later we bring back that junk and sell it back to them, and that is honoring to God or providing any real money. That's not stewardship. I believe it's abuse. I certainly do not advocate very many fundraisers because fundraising events, I better hush before I get in deep trouble. Yes, ma'am?
At our church, when Jody came, he started it, he has someone hold up just a big glass jar. Okay. At our church, when our minister came, we started holding up a big glass jar up front. And during the first hymn, that money that went in there was just supposed to come out of your pocket, just your change in your pocket, and go for missions. And there were different designated missions each Sunday. They kind of rotated. Our mission giving has gone up so much, it's unbelievable. We now can operate a Haiti mission in Haiti and do a lot of other things, and it comes from that money, just pocket change going in. And you feel somehow it starts the service out right because you see people up there and giving, and it's just a great time of community.
The creativity about how we receive money is very important. And the creativity of where you and how you use your offertory. We'll show something about that this afternoon and talk about it more intensely. Yes, sir.
There's something we started a few years ago was add $1. And we've just encouraged everybody that's there to add $1. And it's amazing how many thousands of dollars we've gotten each year extra for that to do for ministries.
Well, there is a campaign like that. It's the challenge from leaders to each other to up their commitment and then say to the church, up yours. I'm sorry, I'm retired now. They can't do anything to me. I want to shift gears a little bit. Roger Redding is the president of your foundation. Your foundation has done more in stewardship education than most in the 54 area foundations. Excellent leadership. And to introduce Roger, I would say that he has a really good mind and a really good heart. Roger, take us to lunch.
And people are hungry. I thought it was dinner program. I didn't know. I've got a box of some materials that I want you to go home with and some things that I'm going to reference. Paul, Bill, maybe a couple volunteers come up and help us get some of this junk out. Would you mind? Thank you, Dwight. They're slick and yeah, good junk. I'm excited to be at Concord to see what this church has done through the years. Got a couple of quick stories while they're passing stuff out. One of my favorite donor stories was a fellow by the name of Schuler Stooksbury. He and his wife never had children. Schuler was a mailman, tight as bark on a tree. Had about every other nickel he had. If there was a board on the side of the road in his mail truck, he stopped and picked it up, put it in his barn. Had one of God's great friends that went to church with him that's on our foundation board, Charlie Kirkendall. Got a call one day from this church about this fella. His wife had passed away, was Presbyterian, never joined the Methodist Church, but she always respected Schuler. She had developed cancer. And one day they sat on the front porch of their little farmhouse and said, "What are we going to do with it?" She said, "Schuler, you've always talked about mission and ministry in the Methodist Church. You're so proud of what the church does. I think you should give it to the Methodist Church." Schuler didn't want to talk with us, but called his pastor and business manager, said, "Could you come meet with us to talk about what Schuler could do?" Well, they left out the part that Schuler owned a 16-acre farm that they built Farragut around. God, didn't even know it was there. Schuler wound up giving us the farm, got a huge capital gain, and he wanted the check. He got this great 8% payout guaranteed for the rest of his life in this trust. Moved into NHC, assisted living. Wanted that check every month, and he turned around and gave it to the church. Golly, you can't make some of this stuff up. One of the things we helped with was a document that said, oh, this was going to be for missions, but we don't need a document because we know what that means. Do we sometimes? So what we helped was a document that said what this intent of this fund was and what it wasn't. I go to a church, and I know sometimes if we have a mission fund and we need to pave the parking lot, well, if we're going to have a mission fair in the parking lot, surely we can pave the parking lot with that money. Well, that's not mission fund. We all know that, but we try to rationalize ourselves sometimes with that money. Well, anyway, Schuler's money came in. It was awesome. The property was valued at $1 million. I had kind of a bid process with interested folks without an agent. We got $1.2 million and came into the church, and what the church does with that every year is change people's lives. Schuler would be thrilled with how this church is stewarding that fund money and the difference it makes. About 6 months or so, I got called into this church to visit with a couple. Did you see the fountain when you came in? This couple met, married, had nothing. Raised in the boonies south of here. She came and taught high school at Farragut High School, and he worked at Oak Ridge. Raised their 3 kids in this church. They took that mission, that youth choir trip every year. You know, you ride roller coasters and sing at a nursing home. Most of our big churches do that, you know what I mean? And they have fundraisers, and you have to buy tickets, and you have to go, and if you were the choir director, you'd be worn out. Got to meet with this folks, and I said, tell me about yourselves. And they told about raising their 3 kids in this church. Said they become great adults. Said their kids got involved in the youth programs, and it got them to be good adults. Their kids drug them to church. Drug them to church. They'd sing at the early service. They had to be at the early service. Then they'd sing at the other. They had to be at that one. Church was a way of life in their family, and the kids drugged the parents. Their kids got to be good adults. Cancer claimed their son, Mark. He's 41 years old. But I'm listening to Mama, and she says, he's still my baby. Instead of being bitter, oh my goodness, they said, we thought about this church and the difference it makes for us. And we want the church to be able to make the difference for others. They gave a $100,000 gift, and they said it was for the youth choir. And the youth choir director came in, ooh, Brent, don't get mad at me. And he was going, yes, whoopee. No more car washes, no more stuff. We're going to Europe. The youth choir's going, we're going to have this great trip. And I'm looking at the parents, and Vicki, that's the business manager here, said, tell them how an endowment works, Roger. Well, it's $100,000. It's got to cook a little bit before you can spend it. And we have this thing we use. I'm going to put it, it's in your packet. I want to go over it with you. It's numbers, it's boring, but it's so important. We're going to spend about 4% of that each year to do stuff, not 100,000. About 4% of that. And the parents wanted it to help those that couldn't afford the trips, to help provide anything they could to enhance the program for the church. Not that they'll never go on that fancy trip somewhere, but that wasn't the intent of the gift to do that. It was to make a difference in people's lives. When I think of this church, I think of those two. And I get excited because I know that same thing can happen in any church across our conference, and it does. Paul Bowman, that's with me, and Bill Kilday, we're thrilled to have you here today in service. We had a great time with Michael yesterday, with pastors that we've trained through the years. It was a blessing to be a layperson and to listen to what they went through, and what some of our pastors are doing in their churches is amazing. I'm so blessed to hear the difference that they're making. You got a packet of junk, and I hope there's some useful tidbits for you and your church. Foundation is known by many of us, unfortunately, and I guess we earn this. That's where you invest money. That's kind of the conference bank, okay? We do that. Investing funds and managing those funds, and the management fee we have is what provides our budget. We're not funded by the conference. We were set up to do that. So we have a vested interest. We want to help churches manage money because it helps us do the things that we want to do. And we do that very well. So I want to tell you, for example, this year to date, and this is at the end of August, our Balanced Growth Fund is up 8.36%. That's wonderful. I can't tell you what it's going to be next month. I can't tell you what it's been at the end of the year, but it's a very well diversified, don't put all your eggs in one basket fund that's very low cost and very effective over the long term. A couple of numbers I'm going to give you with this and these others is kind of important. We also measure what did it do this month, what did it do last month, what's it done year to date, what did it do in the trailing 12 months, what did it do over each year. 10-year average return on this fund is 6.56%. Its average annual return since 1990 is 7.22%. Now, why is that important? Because if we're talking managing long-term funds and endowments, and not all gifts are endowments, I'm not talking your annual budget, I'm talking special purpose funds. What we need to learn in churches is how do we spend from those accounts? Investing is one side, but how we spend. In your packet, you've got this little chart. I shared it with the leadership group earlier this morning. Find that in your chart, if you will. On one side of it, I want you to look at the side in the big green letters. It says CD. Okay? This is what most of us in most of our churches, I don't know if it's an important number or not, about 16% of Holston Conference churches have any kind of account in the foundation. I don't brag about that. I just know there's more opportunity. Some of our churches claim to have nothing, and some maybe are really struggling and don't have much. Some are blessed with lots of resources. But what do we do in finance committees and trustees and stuff in churches? We call around and we say, what rate do you pay? And we've got the cemetery fund, and we've got the scholarship fund, and we've got these things, and we say, what rate do you pay? And this reflects that. This sheet reports average annual returns on 12-month CDs from the Federal Reserve. And you'll look, in this case, this is an illustration of a gift given in 1992, and the church was tempted to many times, I'm sure, through the years. Now, Mrs. Smith gave this money, and it was supposed to do makeup, music, every year, $100,000, wonderful gift. And you spend the interest off of it. You call and get the best rate you could in the country, and you happen to get it. And by the way, this gift happened to happen on January 1st. Just real convenient. And that first year you gave away 3.76%. You remember when there were numbers like that on CDs, and then 5% up? And look through the years what they did. This church was, boy, they were faithful. Every year they took the interest off that and did what they were supposed to. They didn't pave the parking lot. They didn't do anything bad. Through the years, this fund would have produced ministry that totaled $74,560. This is the tragedy. What was the fund worth after you did the distributions? Well, it's $100,000. We still have the gift. But what is the gift worth in time value of money? See, this wasn't a short-term fund. This was something that was supposed to last into the future. This was an endowment. This isn't an annual budget. This is still supposed to be here doing stuff. From the Labor Bureau statistics, there's a website you can put in. It's called an inflation calculator. If you spent the interest every year on this $100,000 fund, you have $100,000. But to spend the same as it did in 1992, it needed to be worth $164,091.45. This fund went down. This is what most of us do, many of us do, because we can lock in. We say, what rate do you pay? We understand that. What I want you to do is flip the page over. This is important for several reasons. I wish you would be blessed with these opportunities in your church. I wish some of those designated funds that we regret, we don't want, would have a lot of zeros on them. And we could use them to fund some of the components of our budget or to do extra mission and ministry. There's a law that Tennessee's passed, Virginia's passed it, Georgia's passed it. It's called the UPMIFA law. And it says that, gosh, as fiduciaries of charitable purpose funds and nonprofits, we're supposed to be aware of, is it long-term or short-term? What's the purpose? And we're supposed to invest in a diversified manner. Don't put all your eggs in one basket across all asset classes. That to me means that over the long term, stocks outperform bonds that outperform money markets. Anybody seen a great bank CD rate? Any on any sign? Not any. If your church is spending that 0.25%, you're losing to inflation. These are the real returns on a fund that we have that's called the Balanced Growth Fund. The one I told you that's up 8% year to date, that. Look what it did in that very first year. And by the way, we say if it's a brand new fund, if you can let it, and you got it today, when can you start spending on it? You just got it today. Well, it's got to simmer a little bit to produce something. And if you can, if you're allowed, we did this at Fountain City, didn't we, Mary Frances Tucker? If we can, we want it to simmer for 3 years, because eventually law says we need to spend on a rolling 3-year market value average. It's important to measure the same time every year. We suggest December 31st because that just kind of works out. Doesn't have to be then, but it's a great tool to do that, be consistent. And every year when that average comes, take money out of the endowment and move it to a separate spending pot. Now, why is that important? Because even though you may not spend that money, how are you going to know 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, how much is available to use? There's 3 people on your church committees when they're making decisions like this. There's one that says, are you crazy? Have you watched the news? Bob, have you seen the news? You heard that serious? Oh, we better not spend anything because there's a rainy day coming. Are you kidding? Eric, we better hold some of those monies. Well, let's don't tell anybody we got this. You know, let's hold this. Somebody else is so moved by mission and ministry, even if it's a music fund, if it's a mission fund, if it's a scholar, surely if we've got $100,000, we can spend 50 of it. Let's don't be greedy here, folks. We need to use that. Have you seen the needs? The bathrooms need to be fixed up. We got all these issues, and those are true. Third person on the committee listens to the first 2 and says, how much did we spend last year? You know, that's the magic answer, what we did last year. It didn't matter how it produced or what the volume was. So what this does, this formula, helps you manage. We ask churches in the bottom left-hand formula to adopt 0 to 5% of a rolling 3-year average. 0 means we don't want to. We don't have a need this year. We don't want to waste the money, but we've taken it out of the endowment and put in the spending pot, which, by the way, is invested in something short-term, so it's not subject to stock market risk, something short-term. But we always know when we look at our endowment how much is available to spend right now if we need to, and how much is the endowment. That helps us manage expectations. If it's not producing enough, we can go back and ask everybody to add to whatever it is we're trying to do to get enough. We can do challenge grants out of that. We can be creative in what we use that fund for. The difference is, look at this through the years. By the way, this church, look at the market going down in 2000, 2001, 2002. Only time that's happened since 1926, and people at the time said, oh, it can't go down 3 years in a row. Well, it did. Now look at 2008. We're all feeling 2008 still. It was not fun being in churches that we're trying to serve. That's why Michael was making his reference at me. And I'm going into churches and saying we lost 19.5% in that fund. People would say, you should have known better, you should have done stuff under the mattress. Folks, it goes up and down, okay? It's being faithful for what works. Anybody that can tell you what's going to happen this year is lying or lucky. Same for next year. But over time, stocks will outperform bonds, they'll outperform money markets, so don't put all your eggs in one basket. Be diversified. Use this as a tool, but spend wisely. This committee could have any year said, let's only spend 2%, let's spend 3%, because, boy, it's been pretty dicey lately. But they said, let's spend 4%. Gosh, in 2012, they spent $7,676, and nothing was ever added to this fund. And it started off spending $4,600. So we're seeing a trend of growing distributions. That would have been 7.6% if we looked at that original $100,000 gift. But look at what the fund's worth at the end of the year. You gave away more than the gift, $133,000. Praise the Lord. Isn't that wonderful? But look at what it's worth. The fund doubled now. This is a different approach. It takes some evaluation from committees. I've seen some amazing little churches with cemetery funds that are worried about cutting the grass on 0.25% CDs that are terrified that have done this. I've seen some others that they'll all be in that cemetery for we have a chance of probably getting that money too. If we can be of service to you, a finance committee, evaluating things like this. Now, my favorite thing in the foundation is working with people. It's the Schuler-Stewksburys. It's the people that love your church. Some of them don't always trust your church, but they love your church, or they love Holston Home, or they want to dig wells around the world, or they want to do scholarships, or they have a vision of something that's not an institution. It's feed the hungry. Amazing gifts, things that people want to do to be generous. They don't know there's anybody to talk to. Study was done of the Methodist Church by the Alban Institute, and that's what it said. All kinds of people of wealth and influence, some of them don't think it's our church budget. Now, I think it can be our church budget. One of the things that Paul and I and Bill do is educate and work with churches to be good stewards. In your packet, you'll see a little brochure about the endowment and plan giving program. If your church doesn't have one, there's not a cookie cutter. Some of our bigger churches, First Ooltewah, I'm seeing them sitting here, have adopted a document. I can look around the room and see several churches that have done that. We can share documents that other churches have adopted. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We got a document. I'll be glad to send you a document. We review that every year and add to it. We've just recently added in 2012 Book of Discipline that became effective this year. The name of the committee changed. It used to be the Permanent Fund Committee. That was wrong. Some churches took that to mean there was a fund and it was a committee. Well, can be a committee, but we added endowment, took off fund, and planned giving ministry committee, because money and handling money and planned gifts is a ministry. It's what it does out the other side, but managing it is important. If we can help your church explore having a committee, to some of you, you don't need the bureaucracy. You don't need a layer. We can help you adopt that same thing in another committee in your church. Paul and I come and do programs. You're the first group that's seen this. In your brochure is a sample church brochure. We can customize. Paul, which church is this? Where's Paul? Floyd United Methodist Church in Virginia. They don't even have an endowment committee yet, but they're talking about it. They hadn't seen this either. They're going to be wowed. It's got their church's face on it. Paul's preaching there in a week or two. If we can help your church with materials to vision and think about what can happen and to assist you, we're the back office operation that we work for your church. I was in the Tazewell district a couple of weeks ago, and the DS said, tell them that you're not the conference. Most of our people in churches, and I'm one of these, I didn't know what a conference was. Before I got involved, I went to church because my preacher, Jerry Anderson, told fishing stories. And there was a mountain in every sermon that he had. And then along came Steve, and we bought the Lowe's building across the street, and our whole church has been amazing and changed. Our church wanted to do this years ago because this church did it. And John Bales has helped us launch this just within the last year. And the irony is, one of our first endowments is to Steve Salee. In his memory. I wish it wasn't his memory. We've got that. It's going to be part of the heritage of our church. Many times the gifts and the stories in our churches are what launch greater things into the future. We need to tell those stories. Jesus told stories. He talked about money. If we can assist you in any way, you've got a bunch of stuff in here. Our general brochure. This tool is currently being reevaluated. You're the last group that's going to get this. We've given out more of these than any document in the foundation. This is called a personal record information book. It's great for Sunday school classes and members in your church. It's about, how do I get my affairs in order? Do I have a cemetery plot? Does my family know it? What are the hymns I want sung at my funeral? Do I want memorials to the church? Who does my taxes? Do I have a safe deposit box? What's my computer password? We're sneaky. In the end of this, we say, what's your legacy? What happens when you're gone? We suggest that might include, first three things, your local church, without restriction. Any finance committees want that? Yeah. Manna from heaven is amazing sometimes. Your church for one of your endowments that you've created, if you have those, or your church for suggested use. And then there's camps and ministries and Wesley foundations and scholarships and missions and all kinds of things that make the United Methodist connection truly an amazing, amazing thing. We do a lot as a church, as a connectional church. And many of our folks know that and have passions for different components. They want to make a difference. We can even help churches determine policies on when you have a fund with a name on it. We don't do that very good in church. I find that to be very different in our churches. People don't want that. But boy, sometimes is that liked? And it's an opportunity. They know the University of Tennessee can do it, but they don't know there's a way to do that in their church. If we can be a servant to you, whether it's a program or investigation, whether it's looking at the future, whether it's a stewardship issue, call on us. We are now when I came to the foundation 13 years ago, I'm not sure exactly where we ranked. We were the 21st, 22nd. You know, this is numbers. It's big of those 50-something foundations that Michael talked about. For a brief year, we were the 10th largest a couple of years ago. And then the North Georgia and South Georgia Conference foundations merged into one, and they passed us. So we're number 11, and that means that we try harder. We now manage $86 million. About a third of that belongs to local churches. About a third of that belongs to institutions within our conference. And about a third of it is planned gifts that individuals have created that are coming back to those churches and institutions. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I suppose that lunch must be ready, Bill. Are you going to make an announcement? But thank you for being here.
If there's a more passionate layperson in hosting conference than Roger Redding about what he's doing, I'd like to meet him. He's true to the heart. Okay, we are, I'll just one personal word here before we go on. Roger was talking about that little book, and it's important to share with your family what your wishes are. My parents were in a terrible wreck. My mother died. My father was incommunicado for about 2 weeks. My brother and I had to make decisions. We found a place to bury our mother. And 6 weeks later, our father said, "Where'd you bury your mother?" And we told him, and he said, "We had cemetery plots." But he never told us that. We didn't know what their thoughts and their plans were. It's important for a lot of reasons, and that's just one short story. All right, we're going to go to lunch, and Brent, where'd Brent go? Brent's going to lead, he's going to be Moses, and he's going to lead us through the church down in front of the